June 8, 1984, Joe Todd interview with Mr. John Knudsen, Watonga Cheese Factory. Sir, where were you born? Where were you born?
I was born in Pennsylvania, northern Pennsylvania. In fact, right on the New York state line, in 1940. Same year the cheese factory was established.
And when's your birthday?
April 8th, which is, 50 miles from Bedford.
Okay, I have some family over in Bedford.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, that's the part of Pennsylvania which is quite rural, and it's the big milk producing area of Pennsylvania. In fact, that's probably why I was living there, because my parents, or my father, was with a dairy company there in northern Pennsylvania. And in fact, the county where I was raised had 4 milk manufacturing plants in it, in the county, which made it probably the largest milk processing county in the state. This was years ago.
Yeah. Who's your father?
John A. Knudsen.
And your mother?
Helen K. Knudsen.
What was her maiden name?
Cum. K-U-M-M.
Are they both from Pennsylvania?
No, my father was born in Denmark, and my mother is from West Virginia.
Denmark. When did your father come to this country?
He came at the age of about 4. His father was from Denmark, but his father had previously been in the United States and worked at a couple milk plants before my father had come over here. My grandfather would go back and forth from, and originally I think he came over in 1898. That was be my grandfather.
What was his name?
Matisse Peter, P-E-D-E-R, Knudsen.
How do you spell Matisse?
M-A-T-H-I-S.
How come your family came to this country?
Oh, I think my grandfather came from a seafaring coastal island off the west coast of Denmark, and I think, to be quite frank, he came for the same reason that a lot of other people came for, is that the sea business wasn't very good and at that time, and he just had an itch to go somewhere, and he just chose to come to America.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, he was not in the dairy business. My grandfather was not.
He wasn't.
And I think, at least it's been told to me, that he would, before he came to the United States, he wanted to be an expert in some field. And he didn't think sea captaining, and he did a little bit of forestry work over there, but he thought, well, Scandinavians are always affiliated with the dairy business. So before he came, he went to the local library and brushed up on the dairy business, and when he came to the United States, by quote, he was an expert. At least he said he was.
And where did your grandfather settle when he first came over?
Oh, I think they originally went to Los Angeles and San Francisco, and he worked in a milk plant.
That's unusual.
That's very unusual.
You think mainly Wisconsin and Minnesota up in that area.
That's where he ended up. But after, in fact, he was there during the 1906 earthquake.
He was.
In San Francisco.
Well, he was in the earthquake.
He was in it, but I mean, not affected by it.
Yeah.
But they were.
Did you ever talk about the earthquake?
I have my aunt, who was older than my father, would tell about it. She was 4 years old, or 5 years old at the time, and she remembers the tents and the fire, and seeing it. At the time that she and her mother were, they missed the earthquake. They got there a day or two after it happened on a train. And that's all I can remember. That's one of the first things she remembers about her life, though, is that how rough it was out there at that time.
Well, I'd be surprised if trains were still running. Looks like the tracks would be all
Well, I'm sure they probably got off
Oh, yeah.
on the other side of the bay and took a horse and buggy or something else. You know, I don't know how they did that, but they did make a train trip from the East Coast to them at that time.
And what part of Denmark is your family from?
Well, my grandfather was from a little island called Fanø, which is off the west coast of Denmark, just barely off the coast. And it's a tourist place now, but then it used to be a fishing a lot of boats, fishing boats that would go clear around the world. You know, not necessarily whaling boats, but some were whaling boats and some were just regular sea for fish that they.
What did your grandfather do with the sea business? What?
Well, now actually, my grandfather was spent no time on the sea. It was his father and father several generations before that were on the sea. My grandfather was got out of the sea thing and kind of did a little work with a logging business, and but he didn't like that, and that's when he decided to come to America.
And what part of Denmark was your father from?
Okay, my father was born in the town of Odense, which is the home of Hans Christian Andersen, which is, I think it's the third largest city in Denmark. It's right in the center part of Denmark. That's where he was born. And but he didn't spend much time there, and he can't even remember it. Kind of before my grandfather came back to Denmark and picked up, he was living with an aunt and they came over to the United States, and he never went back to Denmark except for visits after that. He never lived back in Denmark.
Okay.
However, my grandfather did. When he retired in the 30s, he did go back and lived his last 9 or 10 years in Denmark before he died. Reestablished a home there.
How come your family came to Oklahoma?
Well, like my grandfather, my father was involved with establishing plants. They established plants, my grandfather originally in Kansas and Indiana and Ohio, Pennsylvania.
Are these cheese processing?
Some were cheese, some were butter, mostly butter in the early days, because cheese was not a big thing in the United States until end of the 30s. So they were mostly butter and dry milk powder plants in the early days. Well, eventually my grandfather got less and less involved in my business, but my father, who lived with my grandfather in Kansas at the time, and Indiana and Ohio. In fact, he was going to the University of Cincinnati, and he was in his senior year, and he quit college in his senior year so he could go back to Pennsylvania, and there was a dairy plant there, a dairy business that was going that needed some help, and so he just quit college and started going back to get involved in the dairy business. And of course, they established a plant with my grandfather and a couple others in northern Pennsylvania, and pretty soon they had 2 plants and 3, then they got 2 or 3 more in New York State. And so back in this is the late 20s, why they had 5 or 6 plants in New York and Pennsylvania, and they got affiliated with an outfit out of New York City called M.H. Rankin Dairy Company, which was a large bottler in Brooklyn, New York. And what they did, these plants that my father would establish, and also my father's brother, who was involved in it at that time, whose name was Eddie, and then my grandfather too, why they would get involved with the Rankins to take their surplus milk that they couldn't sell for bottling milk in New York, and then they'd attach a manufacturing plant onto one of Rankin's field plants and manufacture the surplus, and that's how they got started in the early days.
And when did your family come to Oklahoma?
Okay, now what happened was in the early 30s, farmers all over the country, particularly the Midwest, at that time were selling what they just called cream. They would have a little separator on their farms, and they'd take this cream after they separate the milk and sell it to a butter factory in an area, and then keep the skim milk and feed it to their calves. Well, the cheese consumption in the United States started picking up in the 30s. And of course, cheese involves the use of whole milk rather than just cream. And so there were cheese factories being established quite readily all over the United States, particularly in the Midwest, in the early 30s, so that the farmer could sell whole milk rather than just cream, and then he could get more money for his milk. Well, originally my father established a plant in Maryville, Missouri, which was the first of getting back involved in the Midwest again. And then they had plants in Iowa and Missouri, and then eventually got one or a couple in Texas. And they got involved with a dairy plant in Grand Prairie, Texas, that processed surplus milk from Dallas, and buttermilk and so forth. And they got a cheese plant in Coleman, Texas, and a cheese plant in Bowie, Texas, and later a margarine plant in San Antonio, Texas, they got involved with. And also at this time, in around the early 1940, the word got out there were a group of farmers in the Blaine County area of Oklahoma that were interested in having a market for whole milk, which of course would involve a cheese factory. And in fact, the Chamber of Commerce, as I'm of Watonga at that time, I don't know if they call it the Chamber of Commerce, but someone who represented a group of farmers put letters out trying to inquire someone with capital to come in and put a factory in. Now, it wasn't just Watonga that was involved in that time, it was also Geary and Canton, I think, the whole Blaine County area, roughly. And of course the neighboring counties, to a certain extent, Kingfisher County and Major County and Custer County was also involved to a certain degree in this. And so my father and my uncle and a third man who was by the name of Ted Daly, who lived in Bowie, Texas, and was kind of overseeing all the Texas plants, came up and they looked at the Blaine County area and talked to farmers, talked to the people, and they came to a decision to go ahead and put a factory in, and they had an argument on where to put it, was Watonga or Geary. And I'm not sure which party wanted which one, but there was apparently a building available in Geary that they thought would work better than the one that was available in Watonga. But in Watonga at that time, there was an ice factory right where the present location is. It's been there for several years prior to this 1940. In fact, I think this ice plant, this building dates back almost to the turn of the century, parts of this building. But I think it was really completed in the late teens. But it was a going ice plant, and they talked to the owners of the ice plant who consented to let them use part of their building to make cheese. And so they finally decided to go that route in Watonga rather than putting the plant in Geary. Now at that time there were other competitors that were competing for farmers' milk then. There was of course Gold Spot Dairy, which was a very going cooperative in Enid that was buying milk and cream in this area. There was also Armour's had a creamery and cheese factory in Chickasha, Oklahoma, and some of their northern routes came up and buffed against some of our routes. So this also at the early days there were plants in further west. There was a plant, I think, early days in Custer City, There was one in Clinton. Elk City had a plant. Back in those days, milk didn't spoil quite readily. They didn't have refrigeration, so you had to have a lot of plants to pick up the milk and process it as readily as possible, because otherwise the milk would sour. Hence, I've heard that State Dairy Commissioner Clyde Lacey state that in 1945, 5 years after the establishment of this plant, there were, I think, 27 cheese factories in Oklahoma. And I know also at that time there were well over 100 bottling plants in this area, but this was the way it was nationwide. Every state had the same situation. Without refrigeration, without transportation, you had to have some kind of a milk processing plant in every second or third town anyway. You know, of course, through years, this trend has gone the other way because of modern refrigeration, because of the economies of scale on larger factories, and transportation is easier. It's easier to transport milk now than build factories. The necessity of having a lot of milk plants has dwindled. Just to give you a comparison, in Wisconsin, which makes over 40% of all the cheese in the United States in one state, at one time had over 2,000 cheese factories, and today that's down to 200 and some odd. And just by the same comparison, was not to say that, so every state was having the same trend that existed here in Oklahoma. But in any case, in 1940 this plant was established, and I cannot recall the name of the first managers, but I know that Ted Daly, or E.W. Daly in Bowie, oversaw this plant, and they included it with the other Texas plants. So he would come up here every other week and check with the manager in the early days. And
He's your uncle?
no, he is no relation at all. Ted Daly is no relation. He's happened to be originally from Canada, I think, but he ran into my father in Pennsylvania, I guess, and eventually he moved to Texas, and he's been there ever since. In fact, he's alive today and doing well. He's about 86 years old.
Where does he live?
In Bowie, Texas.
Bowie, Texas.
Yes, in fact, many of the people here in town are very familiar with him. I get that question asked a lot of the old-timers here. Remember seeing him stay at the Noble Hotel every other week for a couple of days when he was up checking on his plant. And now, the milk in the early days was all what we call canned milk. In other words, the farmer would milk the cow and put the milk in cans. And of course, the milk was all shipped on trucks or covered trucks to the plant, and then the milk was received in cans. In the late 60s, there was a tendency to move towards what we call bulk milk, where the trend was against selling milk in cans, and it started the farmer would buy a bulk milk and milk directly into a tank on the farm, which involved trucks with tanks then after that time that would pick up the milk at the farm in bulk tanks and bring it to the plant.
And are those big tankers you see on the road now?
Yes, those are tanks similar to us. Now, we don't use the larger tankers at this time. We use bobtail trucks, because
I see they have AMPIR
right.
Or something.
That is correct. That's the way. In fact, that's the way 99% of all the milk in the United States is marketed now. There are very few can producers left at all now.
Did World War II have any effect on this plant?
Yes, to a great deal. Because at least to my knowledge, there were extra. It was very easy to sell product during the war. Because of the war effort, food plants, of course, extra strain was put on them to produce cheese. And I know at that time, looking from back records, that big companies like Armour and Kraft and Swift and Wilson and the old-time meat companies that were involved with the dairy business at that time would have contracts with the government for cheese, and they'd come out, and I know we had contracts here with Armour, for example, that to make so much cheese, and it was assembled by Armour, but it was assembled for the government, you know, for the war effort. So at the time, I know during the war that the marketing was much easier than it has been at some other times, as is generally the case in any time there's a war. Usually all businesses do quite well.
Okay. And how long was Ted Daly the overseer?
He was the overseer here from the late 30s, I mean down in Texas. He was overseer here till he retired in, let's see, that would have to have been roughly the early 60s when he retired. And although he never lived here, he was up here quite a lot. He was very familiar figure around town. And he was not the manager of the plant, he was the overseer of 4 or 5 plants, which included the Watonga plant.
Okay. And it was in the late 60s when all the other plants started dying out.
Okay, what happened is, and this is a national trend, and as the refrigeration improved and as transportation improved and the economies of scale of bigger plants, why all these little plants would get in tremendous fights with each other over milk supplies and so forth, and the competition grew so fierce that the weak ones generally wilted. So as a result, why a dominant plant or a group of plants would overtake the little private individual plants. Now, in addition to this, large farm cooperatives expanded during this era, and of course they would have more muscle against the small individual private plants, and they sometimes would just take the milk supply from these private plants one way or another through price or something, and the smaller plants would just close up. In fact, the plants that Ted Daly was involved in Texas eventually were sold off, or the milk supply was given to someone else, and even though it wasn't maybe a direct battle, it was seeing what was coming, and they'd sell out to a larger cooperative and so forth. On the other hand, Watonga had intense value wars with the competitors, but through luck or whatever it is, this is one of the survivors of the demise of dairy plants in this area, because I remember that the Armour plant in Chickasha closed in 62 or 64, and which gave us some additional milk supplies. But see, in the early days, our milk supply came from mostly Blaine County, a little bit of Western Kingfisher County, Major County, and Northern Custer County. Now, as these competitors would die out, the producers did something that the plants were doing. Back in the 40s and previous to that, most every farm was 80 or 160 acres, and each farmer would milk 2 or 3, 4 or 5 cows, have some chickens and a horse and a whatnot. It was a small, well, the centralization in farming came at the same time, where a farmer would say, I can't make it milking 3 or 4 cows. I either have to milk 10 or 12 or quit, or buy the neighbor's farm to make it go. In other words, you had, the plants were following the same thing that agriculture in general was following, and so we had a situation where our routes, instead of being in this 3 or 4 county area, pretty soon got extended out to 6 or 8 counties. Until today, we cover virtually 2/3 of the Oklahoma for our own basic milk supply. We have today, around 50 producers, where at one time we've had as high as many as 400 producers here at one time, but we get more milk from our 50 producers today than we did from 400 back in the olden days. They tend to be bigger, but they're very, very far apart. So we cover a lot of miles to pick up our own basic milk supply.
Is it named just in Oklahoma, or do you go outside of Oklahoma?
Okay, we get all our own milk is in Oklahoma. In other words, all our producers are in Oklahoma. We do also get a little milk, what we call surplus milk, from Texas and from New Mexico, namely because in those areas we don't have a lot of milk processing plants, and in that area, so they have to, when they have extra milk, they have to merchandise it to another milk processing plant.
So it is mainly luck that this plant survived, or?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. Those things, on hindsight, you don't know. We were able to, in those years, well, there were several managers over the years, 4 or 5 in the history of the company, and my brother was here in 1964 when he came and managed the plant, and that explains to a little degree how I got here, because at the time I had gotten out of the service, and those were the days of the draft, and my brother had gotten drafted, and while he was down here with this plant, well, he asked me to come up for 2 years to watch it, and this was in early 1966.
What's his name?
William P. Knudsen. And he's currently in Oklahoma City at our cheese store down there. He runs that.
I drive by that store all the time.
Yeah.
There on Northwest Highway?
On north, on the
Northwest Expressway.
39th Street Expressway.
Yeah, right.
In Belt Meridian. And so I came here in February of 1966, and I've been here ever since. The 2 years went by, and my brother got back out of the service, and he went back to another cheese factory we had in northern Missouri, which has since been sold. So we're no longer, this is the only dairy enterprise that we're involved in.
Who was the earliest manager that you remember? Or the earliest manager?
Oh, let's see. I was thinking one of the earliest ones was one called Harper Knight back in the early 40s. And there was Carl Heaton that was before my brother. And there were a couple of other ones. I can't recall their names offhand, but I can sure look it up.
Now, do you and your brother own the cheese factory?
At this time, my brother and I own most of it. There's a few family members that have a little bit of interest in it.
When did you take over ownership?
Okay.
Established 1940.
Originally, the plant was owned by my father and my uncle, and through a corporation called Center Milk Products Company. That was the one that was back from Pennsylvania, New York. But then eventually my uncle moved to Missouri and ran the milk plants from the Missouri. He oversaw those and formed another company called Central Farms Products Company. And this plant was eventually sold to my uncle in Central Farms Products Company.
What's his name?
Edwin
Edwin.
Knudsen. And for years he ran it, and my father had nothing to do with it. But then the years passed, and for one reason or another, my father bought it back from Central Farms, and we in turn bought it from my father in the middle 60s. My brother and I did.
So you and your brother are the main
Although the main owners, yes.
owners. fast food.
Ask about cheese. I'm not sure I could help you 100%, but I would know a few basics.
Is cheddar the easiest cheese to make?
One of the easiest to make. Well, it's easier for a couple of reasons. Being a harder cheese, it's easier to work with, and it's easier to inventory than a lot of other cheeses because it ages very well. So if you don't sell it right away, it is a good one to hold, because as right now the federal government has a price support system to purchase excess dairy products to keep the farmer's milk price at X, whatever it should be. And if they buy a lot of their products in the form of cheddar cheese or variations of cheddar cheeses because it will hold so well. Plus they have the versatility of melding it to make what we call processed cheeses from it. Other cheeses can be processed too, but cheddar is notably easier to work with than other varieties.
What is the difference between
And cheese is made from the first day up to about 2 months. Then it goes through a mellow stage from 2 to 4 months. Then it's usually sharp from 4 to 9 months. Then over 9 months it usually gets to what we call an extra sharp stage. And then of course, like I say, cheddar cheese can hold up from 3 to 5 years, usually in fairly good shape. Maybe some mold here and there, but the cheese itself is usable even at that late date. In fact, indeed, a lot of the government surplus cheese that they're distributing now is 2 to 3 years old, and except for occasional mold, why it's quite usable.
how many different types of cheese do you produce here?
Well, we can, with our facilities here, we can make 3 or 4, 5 varieties, namely cheddar and Colby and Monterey Jack and Munster perhaps and brick cheese, because those are all similarly made cheese with the same equipment that we have that we can make. Other cheeses such as Swiss or mozzarella involve other types of equipment that we could make it, but we'd have to modify the plant to do it.
What about blue cheese?
Blue cheese we could probably make because it's a cheese that's made very similar to cheddar, and it would just involve at the end putting the mold in it to get the mold to grow in the cheese to give it the tangy flavor. But we could probably make blue cheese here without too much effort.
Before you came down here, were you involved in the dairy business?
Yes, when I was growing up, I worked very menial jobs from age 13 on in milk plants, summer times and after schools. And in fact, I got when I was growing up, I'd worked in the plants in New York and Pennsylvania, particularly Pennsylvania. But then, when I was in high school, my father sent me to a summer in Iowa to work in a butter plant there, and then a year or 2 later, I went to another, it happened to be a butter plant too, in Missouri, when I was going to school. And at that time, I swore I'd never get into this business.
What happened?
Well, of course, it was a good way to learn the business because you learn from the bottom, which you always can appreciate anything learning from the bottom up. And of course, at the time when I was young, I kind of thought that this would be an awful way to be at the bottom and work at this hard work. And I thought, well, maybe I'd try something else. But once I got back into it, and looking at different phases of it, it's been much more enjoyable.
How many employees do you have here?
We have, including our drivers, approximately 20.
Would you classify this small, medium, large factory?
As a cheese factory, it would be, and of course this depends on how you look at it, what time frame you're talking. In the future it'll be considered small, but at the time being it's about medium. Namely because there are so many very, very large plants now.
They're mainly what, Wisconsin?
Some are, but then there are others in metropolitan areas where there's a lot of milk utilized. Well, they usually have a plant that has a tremendous capacity. In fact, there are several cheese factories that I know of that manufacture or can manufacture 100,000, in excess of 100,000 pounds of cheese a day.
That's about
And ours is, 2 to 10,000 pounds a day is a typical day. But then there are several plants that are much smaller than ours that I know of also. Many.
How many plants are in Oklahoma?
Right now there are 2 cheese factories currently, the other being in Tulsa, where they have a fully equipped cheese factory that I don't believe right now is making cheese, but they have the full capability of doing it. They have a butter powder plant right next door, and they've been going that route for the surplus milk.
How far do you distribute the cheese?
We distribute under our own name. It's mostly in Oklahoma and a little bit in Texas and Kansas and Colorado, New Mexico, and Arkansas, for example. But when we wholesale some of our cheese, which we do, we go in the national market with some that could end up anywhere. So our cheese can be consumed anywhere, but we only sell in our own name in our area. Although with our Christmas brochures and so forth, well, sometimes we're mailing them even out of the country, let alone.
When you wholesale it, what name does it go under?
Watonga Cheese. Our Watonga Cheese Factory is the name we've adopted for our firm. People just, it's interesting because in the early days, we made 100% of our cheese for other firms, namely the big meat factories. And in fact, for the first 25 years of the factory here, a large percentage of our cheese was sold to Wilson and Company in Oklahoma City, or through Wilson in Oklahoma City. And eventually the big meat packers like Armour, Swift, and Wilson got out of the dairy business. They were big in the dairy business in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and then around, but then they got back to stayed in the meat lines and got more out of the dairy line, and Wilson was no exception. And of course, in those days, by 100% of our cheese would go to firms who would then in turn market it. Now, through the last 20 years, we've had people that would find out we're a cheese factory here, and they would stop by the plant and want to buy cheese directly from the plant. Well, this type of business eventually started out with less than 1% of our business. Today, we market ourselves well over 50% of our cheese through our own marketing, where years ago we used to depend on someone else to do that for us, which is one of the big things in survival of our type of business.
I was in Safeway the other day and I saw Watonga cheese.
Yes, well, we sell to several individual stores plus several chains, and they market our cheese, mainly from the people of Oklahoma have heard of our cheese, and they will support a locally produced product, and as a result they put pressure on store managers to carry our product, and we have several stores, mostly in the western 2/3 of Oklahoma. We're debating, spending more on the eastern side too, but it's further away, and that maybe sometime in the future we'll get more involved over there also. Appreciate that.
Let me see. I think this brochure you have explains the cheese process pretty well.
Well, we made that brochure because we had always 2 or 3 questions that they'd ask us. One is, how do you make cheese? And we tried to make a little synopsis there and try to use less words than what we did, because it's so ended there, but it's tough to explain how to make cheese in just 2 or 3 paragraphs.
It is.
I
didn't know. I had no idea how you make cheese until I read this.
So we just did put that down there for those who are interested. I have to wade through all the language there. But then on the back we also give a little history of our firm, which...
The one thing I didn't understand is hooping. It says hoops are stainless steel containers of many sizes and shapes.
Okay, hooping is nothing more than when the curd is made and it's in its loose form, it needs to be put into some kind of a mold, and they call that a hoop or a hoop or however you want to say it. And that's nothing more than putting the curd in that particular container and then hydraulically pressing or putting pressure on that hoop. And of course that makes one solid piece of cheese the following morning or 12 to 18 hours later.
I noticed that here you sell just the curd. These little packages. Is that?
Yes, we sell curds are nothing more than finished cheese before it's put into a hoop. Those are the little loose curds that would be pressed to make one solid piece of cheese. And we've had a lot of interest in, as people do, for example, people in Wisconsin are very familiar with curds because they have cheese factories around. They stop in, and of course they snack on these curds before they're put into one solid piece. And we have a lot of business with that. And of course, it's given people a chance to be familiar with that particular type of operation.
How do you like Watonga?
Very much. It's I've lived in small towns all my life, and in Pennsylvania, a town this side, and Iowa, a town a little bit bigger than this, and Missouri, a town about this size. So I'm used to living in small towns, and it's been very fine. This will be my 19th year here.
You said you were in the military?
Yes, I was in the military from 62 to 64 ROTC and served in Korea. Of course, this is well after the war, which made it a very enjoyable tour there.
Where'd you go to college?
In Gettysburg College, Pennsylvania. Graduated in 62.
What was your major?
Economics and history.
History.
Now my brother went to Iowa State, was a dairy major, so he has more technical knowledge than I have of this business by far.
I guess so. You learned the names of cheese process with OJT?
That's basically the way you do it. Exactly the way
Thanks. Like I said, I'm not sure what to ask about it, but I think we have most everything covered. Do you buy from the big dairies?
We get some what we call surplus milk, and it usually comes from either one of the big bottling plants or one of the dairy cooperatives. They'll have some extra milk, one thing or another, and we occasionally get some extra milk from there.
North Oklahoma City, there's a big boarding plant.
Yes, now of course a lot of the milk marketed, particularly in the Southwest, these big dairies don't have, or bottlers don't have their own farmers. They buy their milk from the cooperative that takes care of the farmers. And a lot of the dairies in Oklahoma do it this way. We're one of the few operations, the other one being in Culbert Dairy in Ardmore, and of course there's some other independent manufacturing milk in eastern Oklahoma that is not marketed through the co-op. But generally a good percentage of the milk in the whole Southwest is milk marketed through milk cooperatives.
Do you don't have any ownership in any of the cooperatives or
No.
any of the producers?
No. The ownership of those, of course, is owned by the members, and they're not private firms.
So I was thinking like, Brahms in Oklahoma City, they have their own farm.
Okay, Brahm has its own farm, but they sell so much milk, they have to buy some from the cooperative in addition to that.
Well, I think that's it.
Okie dokie.
I can't think of anything else. Of course, if I missed something, I wouldn't know it. I would like to take a quick tour if I could.
Okay, let's do that.
Do you have any of your employees, are they what you call an apprentice?
Well, yeah, we had involved, like a lot of firms are, with OJT type things. So when you hire a new employee, he's got to start and kind of learn a little what's
Now,
going
do
on.
your brother have kids that are coming up to?
No, I'm not married. I'm single.
Yeah.
And my brother has a child.
Okay.
So that's kind of the way that is.
Okay. Well, I can't think of anything else.
Okay, well, you say you have an extra tape of that or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, send me one if you got it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.